Hey there. Tonight, let the soft hush of distant thunder roll quietly beneath your eyelids, a prelude to a world where the faint drumming of artillery becomes the lullaby for millions holding their breath. Imagine, for a moment, the cold, unyielding air of Eastern Europe in early 1941, where velvet darkness settles uneasily over snow-veined fields and flickering lights leak from the windows of makeshift headquarters. Unseen, shadows dart across frost-encrusted courtyards, carrying secrets destined to change the fate of nations. But here's the captivating part. Tensions are already strung so tightly tonight that just one whispered command will unravel an empire. And before we reach the end, the single decision from a smoke-filled study high in the Bavarian Alps will tilt the course of history. If journeys through true stories of suspense like this soothe your mind, feel free to stick around, only if you truly enjoy it. While you do, settle in, turn the lights low, find that perfect spot of comfort, and take a deep breath. All across the globe, as midnight tolls for some and dawn approaches for others, we are gathering at the edge of history to begin our story. A hush settles over the early months of 1941 in Eastern Europe, a silence too delicate to last. Beneath this veneer of calm, the great cities and battered countrysides feel the throb of anticipation. In the cavernous halls of both Soviet and German headquarters, the click and scrape of boots echo down marble corridors. Every word spoken seems calculated, with generals leaning closer, hands splayed over maps where the lines between friend and foe are drawn in pencil, nervous fingertips ready to erase or redraw them in ink at any moment. Orders are quietly passed from one guarded face to another, the language of war spoken in glances and curt nods. Out on the fringes where snow still piles against the drowsy forests, Red Army spotters blink into icy dawns, hoping the stillness means peace. But the steady rumble of artillery practice, rolling beneath the wind from far beyond the Urals, says otherwise. Each new day, that rumble grows a little nearer. Elsewhere, beyond the lowland mists, a chain of mountains breaks the winter sky. The Bavarian Alps rise, jagged and stark, their silence broken only by the cawing of crows and the rhythmic march of guards on their rounds. High above, the Berghof stands like an eagle's nest. Its walls hold no warmth here. Adolf Hitler paces, alone at times, peering through window glass so cold it mirrors his breath. His thoughts fix not on peace, but on conquest. Some evenings, the lamps burn into the smallest hours, illuminating blueprints, sprawling maps of Eastern Europe and the USSR, and recent reports, each document a prelude to a cataclysm. Down in Berlin, talk spreads in whispers about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact still holding, its ink not yet faded, to the world. Stalin's Soviet Union is Hitler's uneasy ally. At least in theory. Both sides still playing the game of partnership, smiling for the diplomats, while suspicion coils through every corridor. Joseph Stalin stews in caution within his Kremlin office, beneath the ever-watchful gaze of red stars set in cold stone. His script is one of careful patience. For now, he opts for peace, tuning out the bristling warnings from anxious generals and the growing stack of unsettling intelligence. Stalin wants to put off a new war with Germany for as long as humanly possible. But tension pulses through the military echelons like a faint electric charge. Marshal Zhukov, recently promoted and still stiff with the memories of purges past, wrestles with unease. He would later attempt to counsel Stalin, urging caution, warning against the temptation of a reckless, sweeping advance. Yet the air in the Kremlin feels heavier with each passing day, the atmosphere charged with the sense that someone, somewhere, will soon make a move that strips the mask from this fragile peace. The setting throughout is one of uneasy routine, a world suspended above a chasm, its silence measured and finite. The only constants are the muted thud of boots along tile, the low murmur of high commanders debating over steaming mugs, and, farther still, the omnipresent drum of distant artillery. Foot soldiers sit in barracks polishing rifles that gleam with cold promise. Across this sleeping lion's land, the night is restless and long. A sudden twist, deep inside the frozen earth along the Polish border, engineers and reconnaissance teams work feverishly under the shadows. They camouflage heavy guns and fuel tanks, and each day, south and east, the Wehrmacht amasses quietly, threading columns of steel and men between dark pine forests. The world still expects peace, but under the pale watch of the full moon on these nights, trainloads of ammunition run eastward, past towns that do not yet know what dawn will bring. Sentries along the tracks listen for clues, whispers, or the whistle of an approaching train, dread heavy in every glance. Within every headquarters, both German and Soviet, tension rises and ebbs. Cigarette smoke hovers in the thick air, white plumes curling around faces etched by sleeplessness. The grim calculus is underway, every decision a step closer to calamity. Pinned to walls are maps that tell their own story. The rivers dividing heartlands, forests crowding over borders, roads that snake from Berlin all the way to Moscow. On the southern horizon, wind stirs stale smells of dust and cordite. Across a table cluttered with communiques, generals mark supply lines, debate train timetables, and try to divine the future from the placement of regiments. Restless, Hitler pens his own commands, sometimes answering to no one but his ambition. He speaks rarely, but when he does, subordinates fall mute. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army remains poised on threads of hope and rumor. Soldiers on the night shift hear only the hush of falling snow and the occasional, distant pulse of artillery from somewhere beyond the Dnieper. Letters home are laced with uncertainty. Wives and mothers cling to each missive, uncertain whether to believe the reassurances or prepare for the worst. As weeks bleed into months, a pattern emerges, one of preparation masked as routine. Food stockpiles are quietly amassed, airfields cleared of snow. In hidden rooms, codebreakers listen deeper for patterns in the static, trying to separate fact from deception in a world singing with the static of untrustworthy transmissions. Twist again one muted morning, as day breaks pale over the Carpathians, a single order is delivered via secure courier. It is a quiet, innocuous moment, barely a ripple in the routine, but in less than 6 months, this order will unleash millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks across fields that are still frozen tonight. Its ripples will upend empires and redraw maps in blood. And on the horizon, when the silence shatters for good, at precisely 3015 a.m. on June 22, 1941. The world will wake to a roar so vast it will echo for generations. But for now, this is the lull, an uneasy calm that clings to every heart in command posts, foxholes, and distant cities alike. The fate of nations remains balanced on the edge, waiting for orders behind thick wooden doors and through the wire-bound telephones that never truly sleep. Behind polished oak doors and smoke-filled planning rooms, the weight of Hitler's intent grows heavier, pressing down on every whispered word in a waiting world. Inside the dimly lit corridors of the Reich Chancellery, the stale air hangs heavy with smoke, muffling whispered arguments. Maps glisten under the yellowed bulbs, their edges curling, stained by hours of nervous fingers tracing lines from Poland eastward. Generals shuffle through reports, footsteps echoing on polished parquet. Through those closed doors, the steady thump of artillery from faraway training grounds is never fully absent, like a drummer reminding them all of what is to come. Each evening, as plans coalesce and dissent simmers beneath the surface, the shadow cast by Adolf Hitler grows longer. For him, the Soviet Union is not a distant foe, but the embodiment of everything he vows to erase. Fueled by a mix of deep-seated hatred and strategic ambition, he views the East as both playground and adversary. A vast land to be conquered, yes, but also a machine of ideologies and resources he means to shatter. For months, conversations have lurked around, not if, but how, he will give the order. Beneath grand chandeliers and at spit-flecked tables in field offices near Warsaw, senior officers gather, maps and coffee close at hand. They worry aloud, voices dropping to a hush when aides draw near. Even within the iron structure of command, anxiety seeps in. Swelling with every new railway schedule, every grim forecast from intelligence. The Wehrmacht's might is undeniable. Formidable tanks, crack infantry, and bombing squadrons honed by victory in the West. Yet this operation is colossal, dwarfing any campaign in living memory. If the front stretches thin, will the wolves of the East simply swallow it whole? The general's concerns are not those of cowards, but veterans who know. To pour hundreds of divisions across a continent is to tempt fate. There is too much land, too many men between us and Moscow, one senior commander mutters, voice rigid with frustration. Along these corridors, a single decision reverberates. Months before dawn will break on that fateful June morning, formations are quietly shifted east. Heavy doors thud as orders are passed down. Oak desks in Berlin rattle as trainloads of panzer columns and supply carts rumble through the night toward the Polish borderlands. Engines grind, iron tracks spark, and the breath of thousands of men plumes against the chill, unsure what truly awaits beyond the endless forests. Dusk gathers, drawing long shadows across woods littered with the bones of last winter's fighting. The sound of distant artillery fades in and out beneath the wind. Away from Berlin's plotting rooms, snowdrifts obscure hastily built railway sidings, where ranks of German soldiers unload ammunition, shoveling coal with numb hands. Lanterns flicker, throwing jagged shapes on the frost-dusted carriages. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks, nervous, uncertain, echoing through the cold silence of the coming campaign. Thousands of kilometers away, in Moscow, the tension is different, but no less suffocating. In a cramped, paper-choked office, Marshal Zhukov sits hunched over a table scattered with reconnaissance reports. He leans in, brow furrowed, voice low and urgent, pushing back against the tide of optimism swirling from higher command. "We should be cautious," he insists. "Every fresh dispatch from the border speaks not of minor skirmishes, but of a massive coordinated build-up. Each hour without action is another hour." The noose tightens across the western flank. Yet, behind Zhukov, Stalin sits unmoved, his gaze fixed, jaw tight, dismissing warnings in favor of his own instincts. When Zhukov pleads to delay, to strengthen defenses, it is as if he is shouting into the snow-laden wind. On barren plains east of the Bug River, columns of Soviet tanks stand at readiness, paint already dulled by blowing grit. Operators wipe frost from their visors, exhaling clouds that dissolve into the morning. Among them, rows of T-34s hunker low to the ground, their 76mm barrels gleaming in the pale sunlight, a quiet warning that this frontier will not yield easily. Humming through engine blocks, the tension is palpable. Yet even the best machinery strains under the endless pressure of expectation. Here, in the half-lit hours before dawn, the Soviet lines stretch almost beyond sight. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers march in file, the sound of their boots muffled by churned-up earth and scattered snow. Some are young, barely old enough to remember peace. Others are hardened veterans drawn from distant republics, their faces carved by frost and resolve alike. What the Germans do not yet realize is this: when the storm finally breaks, they will face an enemy whose numbers exceed their own. A force that, at the very outset of Barbarossa, outmatches the invaders in sheer size. Yet among the Soviet ranks, uncertainty gnaws, palpable in the way hands tighten on rifle stocks or stray glances dart skyward. Rumors spill across the dugouts about German columns massing just beyond the trees. At headquarters, commanders trace the horizon, where brief pops of light suggest distant drills rather than outright war. For now, the only constant is the muffled roll of artillery echoing from past campaigns, a lingering reminder that the peace is neither total nor trustworthy. A sudden pattern shift, the first true ripple in this calm but tense tableau, comes as the weather, fickle and unyielding, begins to turn. In those first days of December, as front lines harden and hope frays, something unthinkable happens. Sleek machines, so carefully engineered for conquest, shudder in the falling temperatures. On the edge of Moscow, German crews scramble in the half-light, cursing as tank engines refuse to turn over, oil thickening to the consistency of tar. Fingers freeze before trigger guards, weapons jam, metal snapping and clinking in the brittle dawn. Supplies run thin. Sentries stamp their boots, trying to coax warmth from air that keeps growing colder. To the east, Red Army soldiers find no comfort in the cold, but their uniforms, rough-spun and layered, fare better. Already familiar with the cruelty of Russian winters, they huddle by driftwood fires, passing around sour bread and sharing stories in low, measured voices. Each story is different, but everyone is laced with the same anxious, weighty question: will these steel beasts of the West finally bog down, forced to yield not to bullets, but to the relentless drumbeat of frost? In the stillness before new orders are issued, another moment of reversal creeps in. Not a sudden, cinematic shift, but a subtle, cumulative pressure as the momentum begins to falter. On the map still spread across Berlin's grand tables, colored pins mark planned routes to Moscow and beyond. Now, quiet murmurs rise. Divisions reported missing. Supply routes gone silent. The scale of attrition mounting faster than numbers can be calculated. Each report alters the mood in command. The sense of inevitability that once haunted the corridors begins to crack, replaced by something colder, the real risk that the gears of war could freeze entirely. As dawn finally breaks along the frozen borderlands, all illusions of certainty dissolve. Soldiers on both sides peer through dawn mist and swirling snow, the metallic tang of anticipation tense in every breath. The East, limitless and hungry, waits with ancient patience, silent, except for the distant crack of artillery and the ever-present weight of what might soon unfold. Night edged toward dawn across the borderlands of Poland, lending the world a cold, pale glow that crept over blackened tree stumps and rutted mud roads. The air was wet with a metallic tang, thickened by ground fog that clung around the ankles of marching men. German soldiers advanced in disciplined silence, forming lines that stretched into the thicketed distance. The only audible sound was the steady drumbeat of boots pressing into frostbitten earth, punctuated by the distant, ominous booms of artillery practice further south. Above these men, low clouds pressed against radio wires strung between scarred trees. Beneath, bunkers lit by the intermittent pulsing of radio lamps buzzed with coded transmissions that seemed to hum with anticipation, the signals leaping blindly between language and static. Here, the smell of oil and sweat mixed with the sourness of uneaten rations, while officers bent over worn-out maps, their faces tense, eyes flickering by candlelight from one gravel-thick line of defense to the next. On the Soviet side of this border, dread took on a physical weight. Red Army sentinels gazed from sandbagged posts, eyes prowling the horizon, hands never straying far from rifles. Their breath clouded in the blue pre-sunlight, as orders from Moscow repeated, "Do nothing to provoke a response." Stalin's directive hung unspoken between them. Any action, even the most defensive, might be seen as an act of aggression. So they waited, thickly outnumbering their German counterparts on paper, yet haunted by uncertainty and a strange, suffocating sense of disadvantage. Those from the west could hear the scraping of tanks, steel treads hidden behind poplar copses, while officers from the east, fresh from Siberia, found themselves face to face with a land straining under anticipation, the forests alive with the low groan of the wind rushing through wreckage. In quarters across the Western Front, German reserves pressed into the chill, many not more than boys, cheeks still soft and raw with stubble, their uniforms 2 sizes too large. Some whispered among themselves as they waited beside barbed wire fences, watching searchlight beams sweep across no man's land, as if illuminating their own doubts. For the higher command, weeks seemed to gallop into hours. Maps shuffled, precision timetables set, every moment stretched thin by friction and unease. Field Marshal von Bock, ruler of Army Group Center, surveyed a display of pins crawling east toward the city that loomed over their ambitions. Moscow, aware that the real front wasn't any one battle line, but the moment right before the cannons thundered. The atmosphere inside Soviet command posts was just as tense, though masked in grim stoicism. Under the sickly yellow light, generals stood in a tight knot around a battered table. The smell of pipe smoke hung heavy. A single phone rang. The voice on the line, distant but hard-edged, relayed that new Western deployments were visible. Someone noted that over 30 divisions had recently been moved by rail from Siberia toward Moscow, a movement initiated by sudden news from far-off intelligence plotting Japanese intentions. For a brief electric moment, the balance appeared to tip. A rare, slim thread of hope tangled into the fabric of the reel, that the city might yet withstand the coming deluge. A new tremor of tension cracked the routine. Late in the night, deep in the marrow of an encamped German headquarters, a courier staggered in from the cold, mud-caked to his boots. He carried a fresh order, sealed and urgent. Within moments, maps were re-evaluated, and the fate of entire divisions recalibrated. The operation looming over all, codenamed Barbarossa, would unfurl before the next sunrise. This was the German assault on the Soviet Union, an attack planned under chandeliers and executed in muddy foxholes. The simple weight of its intent could be felt in each gust of wind funneling through the barracks, and in the sharp, acrid taste of fear on the night air. Blitzkrieg doctrine, fast, mechanized, overwhelming, would soon be tested not against empty fields, but on landscapes already scarred by struggle and betrayal. By now, even distant towns felt the reverberations. In Leningrad, the night was brittle and endless, broken only by the echo of footsteps in shuttered side streets and lullabies whispered to children, as if to fend off an approaching darkness. Army Group North, a force that seemed to flicker in the northern fog, would go on to encircle the city, cutting it from the world. This wasn't merely the closing of a fist, but a suffocation, one that would squeeze Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg, for years to come. For civilians in these borderlands, the world shrank with every passing minute. In farmhouses lashed together by desperation and thin wire, families watched trainloads of troops rumble east, the ground trembling beneath them. Some believed that the balance of power might never tip. Others clung to the old rhythms, bread baked in chipped ovens, hands scraped by harvests that now fed armies instead of children. Fear hung as thick as soot, yet the steady pulse of artillery, always in the distance, kept them rooted in an unrelenting present. Suddenly, a new rhythm overtook the old one. Somewhere near Brest-Litovsk, a sudden flurry of coded Morse clattered through a field radio. Officers barked orders with an urgency that bordered on panic. Iron doors swung open. Artillery crews fumbled shells into breech loaders. The suspense snapped into a leaden silence, one that lasted only a moment but felt endless, as if the entire continent were holding its breath in anticipation of a single, irrevocable act. It was as if the wind paused, listening for the first great thunder. Amid this gathering storm, the fate of millions balanced on razor-thin decisions made in echo-soaked rooms. Yet no one, neither hardened general nor green recruit, could see beyond the churning fog of the frontier. Even as both sides watched and waited, none dared to believe they had control over what would happen when the first order was given. With a sudden ripple, the fragile fabric of quiet began to tear. Across every frontier, from the desolate pines outside Smolensk to the icy rivers curling toward the north, movements sharpened, radios crackled more frantically, and men stood poised in the darkness, feeling the world tilt beneath their feet. The steady, unending drumbeat of distant artillery carried over all, a reminder that the hour was nearly at hand. On the other side of the dark horizon, pale light was about to bloom. At the very edge of dawn, the world waited for the first thunderclap that would change everything. The suspense hung heavier than ever, as if each heartbeat was synchronized with the coming barrage, drawing closer and closer still. A faint haze clings to the land as dawn breaks over Eastern Europe on June 22, 1941. The air is dense with anticipation, and the soil itself feels as if it is holding its breath. It is exactly 3015 a.m. when the world erupts. The sky over the river bug shatters with a rolling wave of artillery, and endless muzzle flashes scroob against battered bunkers along the border. The German Wehrmacht unleashes Operation Barbarossa, its vast machine surging into motion across the frontier, once fortified, but now overwhelmed. From the vantage point of a cramped German command post, maps are pinned, cigarettes smolder in anxious hands, and every set of eyes tracks colored markers inching over enemy territory. General staff officers murmur softly, each word brittle with resolve and fear. The first assaults ripple into the pre-dawn shadows. The Luftwaffe's engines howl as they sweep low over Soviet airfields, dropping bombs with deliberate fury onto rows of Soviet bombers lined up, still silent, caught unready in the ghostly light of morning. Flames and smoke unfurl skyward. The ground shakes with the concussive rhythm of distant blasts, a steady drumbeat announcing war's arrival to those not yet awake. Across fields and forests, barbed wire tangles glint in sporadic machine gun flashes as German infantry pour across the river bug's banks, their footsteps already muddy from dew and soot. Villages near Brest-Litovsk jolt awake as window panes rattle. Mothers wrap trembling arms around their children. Radios flicker on in crumbling safe houses and steel-walled bunkers alike, transmitting only static and raining uncertainty. Orders fly through the Soviet command network with desperate haste. Stalin, roused from his Kremlin quarters, stares at his generals with disbelief, the seams of his authority fraying in these first fraught hours. On the far side of the divide, German units push eastward in columns that stretch for miles. Panzer engines churn up black ribbons of soil, and the tracks of heavy tanks slice open the land as they advance beneath a sky split by tracer fire. The men inside barely speak, attention fixed on the horizon, while the world outside is filled with smoke and the warning clang of artillery shells. Even the birds fall silent, shadows flickering across fractured wheat fields, where a single misplaced step can mark the end of all hope. In an underground Soviet operations center near Minsk, candles burn low and typewriters chatter. The news arriving grows worse by the minute, communication lines severed, defensive outposts engulfed, bridges destroyed or lost to the advancing storm. The fate of entire armies feels determined not by the fighting spirit of defenders, but by the breathtaking speed and precision of the attackers. Yet hovering behind every official order is the lingering, almost physical weight of uncertainty. No one dares claim to understand what will follow. As the sun climbs, columns of refugees appear on dusty roads, their lives splintered in the rush. Carts creak, children cry, the scent of fear and burning fuel thick in the air. A Soviet conscript, eyes wide with terror beneath his helmet, glances skyward and sees the vapor trails of dogfights overhead. A tangle of friends and enemies indistinguishable in the chaos. Some wonder, even now, if this is a brief incursion or the end of everything they have ever known. But inside German field headquarters, the initial exhilaration of piercing the enemy defenses mixes quickly with tension. A senior staff officer moves between radio operators, issuing curt instructions. He can smell the sweat and anxiety of his staff as clearly as the oil and gunpowder drifting in from the fields. Suddenly, a courier bolts in, eyes wild, clutching intercepted Soviet communiques. For a moment, a shudder of vulnerability passes through the room. Reports claim local Soviet resistance is already stiffer than expected, and scattered batteries have managed to return fire with lethal accuracy. In Moscow, hundreds of miles to the east, the atmosphere is no less charged. Dust floats in slants of pale light inside Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov's office. The voice of a British envoy echoes off the marble, here to pursue a treaty promising mutual assistance in the wake of this onslaught. The exchange carries the haunted urgency of men forced together by calamity. Each handshake is laced with the realization that alliances now mean survival for entire peoples. Outside, the city is shrouded in uneasy quiet, every citizen tuned to rumors crackling through loudspeakers and whispered from neighbor to neighbor. By afternoon, as the heat rises and earth softens, the scale of the invasion becomes apparent. The German war machine has sliced a seam more than 1,000 miles long, from the shores of the Baltic to the steppes of the Black Sea. Soviet divisions, many conscripts still, teenagers, stagger under relentless pressure. Lines buckle, orders dissolve in the dust, yet here and there pockets of Red Army soldiers dig in, clawing stubbornly at their positions. In a battered village on the outskirts of Białystok, a single T-34 tank lumbers into action, its 76mm gun barking defiantly through swirling smoke. The men inside hear nothing but the pounding of their own hearts, and the grinding of treads as German shells ricochet off heavy-sloped armor. It is in these moments that the stakes crystallize anew. This is not only a clash of armies, but a battle for millions of souls, whose fates are bound to the sound of artillery's iron heartbeat. Every field seized, every bridge destroyed, every village swept by the tide of armies marks a line between survival and oblivion. The tension inside command shelters grows unbearable, as staff realize that both meticulous planning and blind chance now govern whether entire divisions live to see another sunrise. Suddenly, a new pattern emerges on the front. Along stretches of the Dwina River, German spearheads find roads clogged not only with Soviet units, but with desperate civilians and farm animals, an unplanned, seething mass impeding even the precision of blitzkrieg. In pockets along the Pripyat marshes, resistance is unexpectedly fierce. A Soviet anti-tank team, barely out of training, ambushes a column of armored vehicles. For a brief, electrifying hour, the unthinkable occurs. Dozens of tanks stand halted, smoke curling from their hulls amid the reeds. It is a small victory, but inside a German command vehicle, frustration boils over, new notes of doubt prickling beneath the surface. Still, by the second day, the invaders have conquered more ground than most believed possible, driving deep into Byelorussia, their shadows falling across fields that just days before buzzed with the music of summer. The pattern repeats: initial shock, desperate improvisation, and another cruel volley of shell fire. And above it all, the drumbeat of artillery fills the air, blending with the church bells and the terrified prayers of those caught beneath the storm. For the soldiers in these trenches, time itself seems to twist and slow down, every moment stretched by the weight of what might follow. As night falls on this first day of Operation Barbarossa, the scale and horror of what has begun hang over the land like an oppressive shroud. Fires dot the landscape from East Prussia to the edge of Smolensk, reflected in the still waters of rivers scabbed with debris. The air throbs with uncertainty. The resolve of leaders is tested with each coded report and hardening line on the map. This is no ordinary campaign. Here, in Eurasia's battered heart, a single decision can tip the scales for millions who never chose to be soldiers. But somewhere under the smoky cover of darkness, a Soviet tank crew gathers in a grove outside Minsk, sharing bread and whispers of hope. A German officer, sleepless, contemplates a map streaked with blood and charcoal. None know how the tides will soon turn, or how far the shadow of this day will stretch into the future. The horizon still flickers, unsettled, as the German blitzkrieg slices ever deeper into Soviet territory, armored spearheads forging ahead faster than word can spread. A thick pall of gun smoke hangs above the endless flatlands of Eastern Europe, drifting on a hot June wind. The sharp crackle of rifle fire and the dull, unyielding drum of distant artillery are never truly absent, not in the ruined villages, not in the forests torn open by tracked vehicles, and not in the headquarters where decisions will send millions to their fates. Operation Barbarossa moves in a relentless cadence, the German blitzkrieg slicing eastward with a precision honed by earlier triumphs. Yet, here across the brooding Soviet horizon, velocity itself becomes a double-edged blade. In the earliest hours, as armored spearheads lunged forward with iron urgency, local Soviet units staggered under the onslaught. Within 2 days, the mechanized columns had pushed more than 50 miles into Soviet territory, capturing towns whose names tumbled through Wehrmacht radios, one after another like an unstoppable tide. The earth, churned by thousands of treads, was marked by the blackened skeletons of supply lorries and tanks, their twisted hulls evidence of both haste and violence. Minsk became a spectacle of mechanized destruction and stunned humanity. At the heart of the chaos, panzer divisions swung north and south, closing their jaws on entire Soviet armies. By June 29th, 2 of these armored thrusts had met near the city. Their union was no mere tactical maneuver. It sealed the fate of over 300,000 Soviet troops, corralled into suffocating pockets and cut off from rescue. Fields that had not long ago shimmered with summer grain now bore lines of dazed prisoners, thousands upon thousands plodding past the twisted wreckage of machines. Faces were blank or streaked with smoky tears, stunned by the abrupt collapse of order. The air hummed with the distant thunder of continuing battle, victories ringing hollow against the harrowing weight of human defeat. In distant headquarters, maps glowed under the lamplight, rivers and railways inked in trembling arcs. German officers, closing circles on those maps, experienced both jubilation and a nagging anxiety. The Wehrmacht had rarely advanced so fast. Still, in these moments of apparent dominance, questions gnawed at the edges of certainty. Could pace substitute for preparation in a land so vast? Would supply lines, recoiling ever tighter, sustain such relentless drive? Between the celebratory telegrams, warnings flickered that Russia's expanse might devour victories just as swiftly as it yielded them. Yet, for now, the momentum was shocking. News quickly circled through Berlin, Army Group Center. The steel-clad heart of Hitler's plan pressed forward. It was destined, by his own decree, to carve a direct path to Moscow. The vision was bold. A two-pronged assault to seize the Soviet capital and cripple the enemy's will. To many in the Wehrmacht's highest echelons, it seemed the very spine of the Red Army was cracking. But atmospheric dread hung heavy. The German advance stretched out like a drawn wire across the steppe. Tens of thousands of vehicles required fuel, ammunition, and food, all straining through roads increasingly clotted by deep mud and burning debris. Those seemingly endless convoys soon became targets for a Soviet resistance that refused to wither. Every mile gained was measured in mounting exhaustion and greater gaps between spearhead and supply. Inside a battered Soviet field headquarters not far from Smolensk, a junior officer scribbled orders by candlelight. Maps curled at the corners from heat and nervous handling. Outside, the ground trembled with the passage of enemy armor. The officer's hand shook imperceptibly as he dispatched messengers. Each step outside was a gamble with stray mortar shells or roving Luftwaffe patrols. Yet, the whispered news from Moscow was the same. Reinforcements were already being rushed to the front. Soviet manpower, it seemed, flowed like a river that could not be blocked or exhausted. More than 6 million would be mobilized before the end. The atmosphere within German headquarters shifted subtly as days ground by. On the wall, a clock ticked steadily, its sound lost beneath rhythmic artillery blasts that sometimes rattled glass and spilled ink across battle plans. Supplies arrived slower. Engines broke down. The confident marches became cautious, halting crawls. By midsummer, the first shadow of doubt crept through the command staff, as if the land itself resisted being conquered. The pattern of the campaign developed an unmistakable rhythm, ominous and cyclical. Swift breakthroughs followed by stubborn Soviet counterattacks. Vast pockets formed, then slowly crushed amidst bitter last stands. Villages captured, then set ablaze by retreating defenders. Prisoners accumulated in staggering numbers, their fate a silent testament to the war's merciless logic. Over 2.2 million captured in 1941 would never make the journey back to their homes. It was loss on a scale that defied understanding, recorded only as cold numbers in ledger books, but fell deeply in the hollow silence, filling every empty barracks. For every victory, a new challenge materialized, a destroyed rail line, a well-timed flood, or, worse still, the vast distances themselves. The Wehrmacht's famous discipline was tested by Soviet tactics that became increasingly unpredictable. Small bands of Red Army soldiers, thought to be routed, would erupt from hiding and ambush vulnerable columns. German soldiers learned to regard every forest as a possible trap, every ruin as a staging post for tenacious resistance. As July turned to August, the battlefields around Smolensk became a crucible where the character of the Eastern Front was forged. Burned villages marked the ebb and flow of armies, and the land itself became an adversary. Torrential rains transformed roads into seas of viscous brown mud, swallowing vehicles whole and stalling any hope of rapid progress. The tempo of the German advance faltered, and the war's character changed with it. The blitzkrieg, the very word that had inspired so much terror, now met conditions for which it had never been designed. A momentary hush overtook a field command post on a cold morning. Frost glittered on crushed grass. Breath hung visibly in the dawn air. Messages from the rear, once confident and urgent, became clipped, almost pleading. The illusion of invulnerability had vanished. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Moscow's spires loomed, a city now encircled not just by determined men, but by winter's steady approach. But the chain of decisions continued. Hitler, frustrated by the stubborn resistance and the growing gulf between ambition and reality, issued new commands, some contradictory, all desperate to seize momentum that seemed forever one day ahead. The fate of entire divisions turned on these moments, a reassigned Panzer Corps, a diversion southward, a day lost repairing bridges, blasted by withdrawing Soviets. Each choice, echoing out across the frost-rimed plains, bent the arc of the campaign. Then came a tension peak, an abrupt turn that rippled through every level of command. In early December, after months of attrition, the forward spearheads of Army Group Center clawed within 19 miles of Red Square. The city, under martial law, braced for the thunder it heard in the distance. But the weather turned brutal in a single night. Temperatures dropped, snow descended in choking drifts, and engines froze as easily as hope. What had seemed a sprint to triumph slowed to a crawl or came to a standstill just out of reach of the Soviet capital. Through the drifting snow, German soldiers gazed toward a horizon they could never quite reach. Exhaustion numbed the sharp edge of anticipation. The city seemed so near, but behind every swirling gust of wind lay the unknown. The possibility that this land, with all its contradictions, might absorb invaders in the very moment of their greatest triumph. Throughout Eastern Europe, shifting alliances and uprising capitals forced the axis of war to swivel sharply, sending new tremors across a continent already fractured by conflict. The cold corridors of war stretched from Berlin to the Black Sea as 1941 ground relentlessly on. In the heart of Eastern Europe, orders and alliances shifted as quickly as the shadows across cracked headquarters floors. Cigarette smoke curled in the stale air, settling above the heads of haggard field commanders poring over hand-touched maps. Outside, Every wind-twisted dawn carried the thud and low rumble of artillery, an ever-present heartbeat pacing the world into an uncertain future. For the Axis powers, those early months were marked by triumph and trepidation. With the crash of boots and the squeal of tank treads, troops from Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary followed the German spearheads, their faith in Hitler's war machine swelling as columns advanced across battered roads and broken rivers. In distant Berlin, the illusion of momentum felt both intoxicating and fragile. A cup trembling in the hands of men who could not sleep. But not every government bent so easily. In Yugoslavia, the shifting tides of loyalty would soon create a shockwave that rippled across the continent. In late March, the Yugoslav rulers, previously aligned with Germany, were swept aside in a violent storm of protest and coup, their own people toppling them in the dark hours before daylight. It was a move fueled by secret British connections and a firebrand hope for independence, a flashpoint that would spark days of chaos and nights of whispered radio static as old alliances crumbled with every sunrise. The Third Reich's response was immediate and merciless. April 6th dawned not with the gentle promise of spring, but with the roar of German dive bombers slicing through the Balkan air. Columns of Wehrmacht soldiers surged across Yugoslav borders, and the roads filled with armored vehicles and the desperate, hunched forms of refugees. Overhead, the sky pulsed with the distant thunder of engines and falling ordnance, a landscape scored by violence and confusion. In Belgrade, streets once loud with laughter or the call of market vendors fell silent beneath the weight of rubble and fear. Listeners huddled by radios, hoping for word from a government already scattered and fleeing. By midday, flame and dust mingled in the air, lingering well after the last aircraft faded from view. The sudden collapse of the Yugoslav front, so swift, so total, sent shock through German high command and allies alike. These Balkan moves, meant as calculated pushes on a chessboard, instead felt like rolling dice in a game growing darker with every throw. Yet as rapidly as Axis boots stamped out resistance in the Balkans, new currents of unrest coursed through every occupied capital. In Bulgarian, Romanian, and Hungarian command posts, officers eyed their own ranks, searching for signs of doubt. Each new betrayal, whether rumored on a street corner or substantiated by a coded message, redrew the strategic map and unsettled every calculation. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. Victories lost their flavor before the ink on the day's reports had dried, replaced by the sour taste of uncertainty. Meanwhile, to the north and east, German High Command pressed their case deeper into Soviet territory. The humid air of late summer brought with it the steady percussion of advancing columns and the relentless rattle of machinery. Farmers along village lanes watched with grim resignation as foreign uniforms passed their fields, marking each new sunrise with dread. Yet, for the men at headquarters, the drumbeat of artillery was more than background noise. It was a ceaseless metronome, counting out the moments between orders and consequences. With each radio transmission, with each curt nod over a battlefield map, the fate of tens of thousands hung in the balance, a chain linking distant capitals to the front lines, snapping taut with every shift in the war's direction. One brittle afternoon, in a smoke-choked bunker outside Kharkov. A senior German staff officer traced his finger along the city's edge. The prize sat glittering under a grey October sky, its factories and rail yards lying dormant and battered. Army Group South pressed its advantage, intent on capturing the gateway to the Donbass and the resources so vital to the German war effort. By October 24th, Kharkov fell. The city changed hands with the hollow thud of boots on cobblestones, watched by forlorn civilians whose lives would now be measured by the day and who controlled the streets. Across Ukraine, the invasion took on a flavor as bitter as it was complex. While some local communities welcomed the German advance, driven by anti-Russian sentiment and the fresh memory of Soviet repression, others watched in guarded silence, wary of trading one master for another. Old grievances resurfaced like scars beneath the skin, each village a world unto itself, every family carrying stories twisted by ideology, loss, and survival. Interrupting any illusion of security came the news out of Kiev. In September, the very earth around the city seemed to tremble with the weight of disaster. As German pincers snapped shut, 500,000 Soviet men were lost, killed or captured, in the largest encirclement of the war so far. Prisoners marched down rutted roads beneath grey skies, their faces hollow, boots scraping the mud in a dirge measured only by the distant, patient drum of artillery. Back in field headquarters, the mood remained taut as a drawn wire. Each victory brought with it a new, more complicated set of problems. The success of operations in the south seemed to breed only greater scrutiny from Berlin, where generals scanned the ever-changing operational map for signs of fragility within their own coalitions. Anticipation ticked upward, spiking with each coded report that arrived at midnight. The fall of yet another ally, or one more sullen, half-hearted salute in an occupied capital, carried the potential to cascade through all plans, a twist of fate magnifying the terror and hope at the core of this war. In abandoned schoolrooms pressed into makeshift command centers, field radios whispered of insurgency and betrayal. All across the occupied territories, rumors sprouted like weeds from the cracks. Some whispered in Hungarian, others muttered in Romanian. The radio, so often a tool of order, now spread only a deeper sense of foreboding. It was no secret that the Axis alliance concealed as much division as unity. In moments of calm, younger officers confided their doubts over steaming mugs of ersatz coffee, their glances darting toward closed doors. The air itself seemed to bear the scent of nerves, oil, sweat, and fear, thick as the cold Ukrainian mud. A mistake now could trigger not just a lost battle, but a chain reaction that might turn the entire tide. The tension reached another peak as the weather turned. Rivers, once crossable by armored convoys, now ran high and frigid. Bridges, sabotaged in the night, slowed vital supply columns to a crawl. The drumbeat of artillery never stopped, but it grew more ragged, syncopated by sudden bursts of partisan sabotage or the outlaw static of enemy broadcasts. Even the most seasoned officers felt the pressure compressing the space between decision and disaster. And yet, with every shattering volley, a new question emerged. How long could this relentless pace continue? How many alliances, on which so much now hung, would survive the coming frost? The map no longer rested easily on anyone's desk. borders shifted by the week. Every occupied capital in Eastern Europe sat beneath a gathering storm, its fate tied to the next whispered order or unforeseen betrayal, even as a strange calm overtook the shattered ruins of fresh battlefields. The uncertainty pooling in every corridor, every field tent, and every loyalist's heart suggested that the greatest reversals were yet to come. In the last glancing sunlight of autumn, the armies of the Axis, still straining toward their distant objectives, found themselves forced to look back over uneasy shoulders. The fate of millions remained suspended, held by static-filled radio calls and the choices of men hunched over battered, coffee-stained maps. With each tick of the clock, the atmosphere thickened, heavy as the clouds that followed the fighting across the broad steppes. As October drifted toward its close and darkness gathered over the battered cities and fields of Eurasia, one truth became unavoidable. In the swirl of alliances made and broken, under the gunmetal sky pierced by distant gunfire, every victory now arrived shadowed by the potential for disaster. What happened next, on fronts tightening around both Kiev and Leningrad, would set the stage for the war's cruelest uncertainties yet. Smoke drifts low over the shattered avenues of Kiev as the cold of September deepens. Each night brings a chorus of distant thunder, artillery that pounds rhythm into the ruined silence. German command posts, lit by the blue light of radio dials, orchestrate the tightening noose. With calculated precision, German forces encircle the city. By the middle of the month, the trap snaps shut, and two entire Soviet armies vanish from the Soviet order of battle. Their fate, death or captivity, ripples through command centers and family courtyards alike. Within the city itself, panic and exhaustion wrestle for dominance. Columns of smoke mark lost positions, and the thunder of bombardment is answered only by the iron rattle of anti-tank guns and the bark of orders shouted over the chaos. Soldiers fall back street by street, their faces mottled by dirt and fatigue, clutching rifles that now feel heavier with each passing hour. Civilians, caught in the tightening web, drag wounded bodies across broken glass and pray for corridors that never appear. Relief is nowhere in sight. By the end of September, German reports estimate 500,000 Soviets killed or captured near Kiev. The cost in lives is so vast, it blurs on maps and manifests as acres of silent uniforms, stripped of motion, beneath a cold Ukrainian sky. But the horror is not just measured in numbers. Fog rolls off the Dnieper River, carrying the sharp scent of smoldering wood and fear. Children huddle in the shadows of shelled apartment blocks. Each morning, the survivors gather, faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, searching the wreckage for signs of yesterday's friends. The cityscape, transformed overnight from a living metropolis to a labyrinth of wreckage, absorbs stray sunlight and magnifies the shadow that now settles over Eastern Europe. Across Ukraine, sentiments are mixed. Some welcome the Germans, seeing a chance to break free from years of Soviet repression, while others resist, knowing the occupiers will bring their own chains. The landscape is etched with confusion, loyalty shifting along invisible fault lines. The drumbeat of the front mingles with the quieter sound of recalculating futures, a collective gamble in which the stakes are nothing less than the survival of peoples and nations. North, the city of Leningrad braces for a siege. Here, stone buildings line broad boulevards, their decorative facades now chipped and streaked with the sooty residue of recent violence. The German army closes in, cutting Leningrad off from the outside world. Railway connections snap. Roads vanish beneath scythed artillery fire. For the city's 2.5 million residents, there is no retreat. All that remains is endurance and silence between the shells. As October unfolds, autumnal rain slicks the streets and heavy clouds lower over the Neva. Food runs out first. Then, fuel. Relief caravans are a memory, a promise betrayed by the certain geometry of enemy lines. Leningraders count their days in grams of bread, trading family heirlooms for a spoonful of soup. The city's famous theaters and concert halls are repurposed, not for performances, but as communal kitchens and makeshift hospitals. The only certainty now is the rumble of distant artillery, the city's new heartbeat, marking time until the first hard frost. The misery of siege deepens. In November alone, more than 11,000 citizens die of starvation, their bodies quietly shuffled through alleys to be buried atop frozen earth or beneath drifting snow. Mothers tuck their children beneath threadbare coats, humming lullabies designed to drive away hunger. Families conserve energy, speaking in murmurs, hands clasped tightly together as day slips into the endless northern night. Even in silence, the weight of uncertainty presses in, an ever-present companion to the rhythm of the guns. At the heart of both these doomed cities is a slow, relentless transformation, the measure of heroism replaced by the measure of endurance. In Leningrad, the only remaining hope threads its way across the brutal surface of Lake Ladoga. Here, trucks brave sniper fire and thin ice, headlights veiled, engines laboring beneath heavy loads of grain and medicine. They call it the Road of Life. Drivers recite the names of those they must save and those already lost, their passages marked by the steady thumping of hearts in chests and ruts in the ice. Distant from the front lines, Soviet planners wrestle with an expanding sense of disaster. At Moscow's headquarters, Stalin broods under the pale wash of lamplight. The scale of loss at Kiev stings like a personal rebuke. Reports tumble across his desk, littered with casualty counts and desperate pleas for reinforcements. Each decision now unfolds as a link in a larger chain. The consequences, brutal and inescapable, echo through every district from eastern forests to western gates. Hitler, meanwhile, is confident. From his own command post, he recalls the early months of 1941, sketching the plan for Operation Barbarossa, a swift conquest predicated on the assumption that the Soviet Union, battered and surprised, could not withstand a force of such size and speed. The initial strike, synchronized at precisely 3:15 a.m. on June 22, was supposed to bring the Soviets to their knees, with Berlin's generals already measuring victory in weeks instead of months. Yet here, in the mire of autumn, those assumptions drip away with the rains. At this point, a natural pause, a catch of breath before winter descends. A twist in the rhythm arrives. Across snow-blurred corridors and radio-filled rooms, rumor flickers. Japan, the Eastern threat, seems to falter in its intent. By November, definitive Soviet intelligence lands on Stalin's desk. The Japanese ambassador, through a web of subtle cues, signals that Tokyo will not move against the Soviet Union's Siberian flank. For the first time since summer, the Red Army can risk shifting Siberian divisions westward, threading elite troops and supplies through the bottleneck of the railways and onto the frost-bitten battlefields. This single revelation, the sudden slackening of pressure from the east, reshapes the game. It whispers a slim promise of flexibility and resilience. The uncertainty that hangs over both command and civilian alike shifts, just for a moment, from defeat to grim hope. Yet for those on the ground in Leningrad and Kiev, the drumbeat of hardship does not break. The hunger still gnaws. The frost still creeps. Historians may look back and chart the angle of reversals on grand strategic maps, yet for millions, survival remains a hand-to-mouth struggle, drawn out in airless rooms and on ice-laden roads. A city block collapses in Leningrad as a shell detonates, spraying glass and dust into the sparse sunlight. An officer leans against shattered stone in Kiev, scanning the clouded horizon for friendly banners that never come. These are not footnotes. They are lived realities, a chain of decisions and miscalculations, forming the path along which entire nations stumble. With every passing day, the drumbeat of distant artillery serves as relentless reminder. The stakes are everything. One misstep, one falter, and the world shifts beneath the weight of unintended consequence. The unpredictability of war, the quiet horror of starvation, and the insistent hope that clings to whispers of reprieve, all drift through kitchens and cellars. The road ahead is obscured by the thick fog of October, heavy with the reverberation of battles past and the anticipation of what waits beyond the horizon. As the battered defenders and desperate civilians brace for a winter, they fear they cannot survive. The first fat drops of November rain begin to fall on roads winding east toward Moscow. What remains of Germany's mechanized power grinds onward, its supply lines straining and muddying, forced now to reckon with weather, willpower, and a foe bolstered by new intelligence. In the distance, the war drums stutter, then resume their measured beat, a steady undertone beneath the gathering storm. From the dim haze of pre-dawn, army field glasses swept a brutal tapestry, muddy tracks, skeletal trees, and the battered hulks of supply trucks stuck in stagnant rivulets. Autumn, in Eastern Europe, had torn the land open. Rain battered the tin roofs of half-collapsed outposts, while officers huddled over creased maps inside their makeshift headquarters, each one keenly aware of the encroaching misery. A steady, unending percussion echoed from the front, the distant boom of artillery growing more frantic as the day wore on. Every mile clawed from the earth had become a question of survival. Not so long ago, the German spearheads had pressed forward with breathtaking speed. The thunder of tank columns crossing plains outside Smolensk was still fresh in the minds of the High Command. At that moment, Moscow was a prize, a mere 200 miles away. A single hard push, all that separated the Wehrmacht from the very heart of the Soviet Union. Now, stalled in a mire of their own ambition and the onset of autumn, that final distance seemed impossibly vast. Mud had become the Soviets' unlikely ally. The once firm roads, battered by ceaseless convoys, had dissolved into bottomless pits. Field kitchens sputtered, their firewood sodden with rain. Men sloshed knee-deep, boots caked and uniforms sick with cold. Tank treads gurgled in rutted quagmires, engines stuttering to silence beneath skies the color of lead. Every truck was a lifeline for the drive toward Moscow, and yet more and more were abandoned as mechanical failures piled up. Ammunition stocks, so precisely tallied back in the summer, now ran dangerously low, at even the regimental level. Each shipment became a gamble. Would the supplies arrive before Soviet mortars zeroed in, or before desperate hunger forced the men to scavenge what little remained in shattered villages? Through the thin walls of command dugouts, generals listened for the latest dispatch. Hopes rose and fell with each transmission. News from the city indicated not panic, but an ever-hardening resolve. The Germans glimpsed Moscow's spires through a veil of storm, close enough to be haunting, yet always receding, an image repeatedly copied onto every staff map. But behind that paper image, new realities took shape. Stalin, stubborn and unflinching behind walls in the Kremlin, had chosen his moment. On the crumbling threshold, Marshal Georgy Zhukov stepped into the storm. His arrival in Moscow transformed the city's defense into something formidable, methodical, and utterly implacable. As October deepened, Army Group Center lurched forward, still perched within 50 miles of their objective, a breath's distance in military terms, but a world away in the unfolding mud and blood. Gaunt soldiers pressed toward Moscow, their rifles crusted with muck, faces raw with exhaustion. Smoke hung in the forests, where burned villages and shattered fortifications scarred the landscape amid the drumbeat of falling shells. With every movement, uncertainty thickened. Soviet resistance did not falter. Rather, it multiplied. New divisions appeared as if conjured by the very earth, fresh uniforms and bayonets gleaming between burned-out framework. The Red Army, once deemed shattered, revealed depth and resilience beyond what German intelligence had dared predict. Inside Moscow itself, hundreds of thousands swelled the ranks. Workers, students, even the elderly, all swept up into the city's defenses. Tram lines clattered past barricades stacked high with sandbags. The air tasted sharp with iron from hastily welded tank traps. Night after night, floodlights swept the sky, searching for bombers, never catching the advancing dread. Zhukov's command exuded an eerie calm, his orders sparking outward like nerve impulses, each carefully orchestrated counterstroke a balancing act against annihilation. On the city's snow-flecked periphery, Soviet armor massed behind tree lines. Among them, shadows moved, crews checking the bold lines of new tanks and the wide, slanting armor of the T-34, its 76mm gun promising a new breed of defiance. A sharp, cold wind cut through the region as October edged towards November. Frost began to clutch the earth by night, glazing the trenches and rippling across shattered fields. Now, every step toward Moscow was not only a contest against the enemy, but with the elements themselves. The front line blurred in haze and snowfall, where disoriented soldiers lost sight of friend or foe beyond the next ruined farmhouse. Rumors seeped into the lines. A winter would soon arrive, unlike any faced before. In the silent moments between barrages, exhausted men glanced at each other, eyes rimmed with dread. As their breath steamed in the ever colder air, the stark truth became impossible to ignore. The German forces were caught unprepared for the coming winter, their uniforms thin and brittle against the biting cold. Officers had expected a short campaign, convinced Moscow would fall before the snows. Now, those whispers of frost became harbingers of something worse. A slow, grinding attrition for which they held no answer. Yet in those same shadowed hours, the weight of this campaign pressed far beyond the battlefield. In dimly lit corridors of Moscow's government buildings, hope flickered with the arrival of a British diplomatic mission. Beneath the stony gaze of Soviet guards, these envoys sat in council with Vyacheslav Molotov, Soviet foreign minister. The ink dried slowly on a treaty of mutual assistance, a lifeline to a city on the brink. This trickle of foreign support promised much, but no one could say if it would come in time. Outside the lines, all of Eastern Europe seemed paralyzed by anticipation. Rail yards groaned under the strain of troop transports and tank flat cars, locomotives hissing in the mist as columns vanished toward the horizon. The drumbeat of artillery grew ever louder, mingling with the insistent clatter of Soviet reinforcements. Between salvos, some German soldiers wondered how the Great Red Army, once hailed as the largest and most advanced on earth, had found so many reserves. What else might the soil of Russia yield up in its hour of need? There was, for a moment, a lull, a collective intake of breath on both sides. Snow crept higher up boots, froze canteens into solid blocks, turned rifles brittle. Then the silence split. From the edge of the tree line, Soviet infantry surged, bayonets driving through pinprick openings in the German siege. This was no rout or chaotic withdrawal. Instead, it was resistance coiled and released, each step calculated and costly. 70 kilometers ahead, as dusk fell, the city's skyline flickered again, reflecting dimly off banks of cloud. Reports filtered through. The forward German patrols were still some 19 miles from Moscow's Red Square, so painfully close. And yet the distance only grew with each night spent under the eternal hammering of Soviet resistance. Each passing day chipped away at the invaders' spirit, grinding them back from the glint of Kremlin spires. Even as their maps showed a city almost within reach, reality bled through in the form of bitter winds, dwindling rations, and the unshakable certainty that something decisive now waited, just beyond their grasp. In the half-light, the fate of millions hung in the balance. The stakes reframed with every thunderous barrage. Was Moscow truly doomed, or could a battered people force the wheel of history to turn? As the last mortars sputtered in the cold evening air, winter surged hungrily from the north, blanketing everything from gutted villages to fortified steel bunkers. A promise that the next phase of the struggle would be waged not just against an enemy, but against a cold that would show no mercy. Winter's first breath arrived on the heels of a steel-edged gale that swept relentlessly across the flatlands of Eastern Europe, turning churned battlefields into fields of wind-sculpted ice. It was a cold that bullied its way through the seams of every uniform, and found the marrow of each soldier, German or Soviet alike. For the men huddling in shallow foxholes and behind splintered logs, the ancient forests east of Smolensk had never felt so endless or unforgiving. Daylight came reluctantly, struggling through pewter clouds to paint pale silhouettes upon the gutted shells of cottages and the sharp outlines of tanks now rimmed in frost. Inside a battered village command post not far from the outskirts of Moscow, the air was thick with a quiet that felt colder than the outside world. Maps scattered across the table curled at the corners, the ink bleeding where melted snow had been tracked inside by weary boots. German commanders, gaunt and hollow-eyed, pressed mittened hands around mugs of ersatz coffee, grasping for brittle warmth and some hint of reassurance lingering at the bottom of each cup. Outside, their soldiers fought more and more with the cold than with any enemy in their line of sight. Rifles refused to fire, their oil stiffening to glue, while the steel hulls of panzers, once symbols of unstoppable momentum, now surrendered to the elements as engines defied every coaxing hand and lay inert in the gloom. Yet it was not just the weather that swept in unnoticed. From the farthest reaches of Siberia, a new kind of thunder began to roll. The steady drumbeat of distant artillery was now overlain with the rumble of T-34 tank engines, their arrival muffled yet insistent through the snow-laden pines. These Soviet machines, with sloped armor and broad treads, shrugged off the frozen mud with an indifference that bordered on arrogance. Alongside them came men, lots of them, whole divisions, whose faces were obscured by the white shrouds of their parkas, and whose movements spoke of long practice on snowbound steppes rather than the fields of western Russia. They handled their rifles and mortars with an easy familiarity, a confidence forged not just in training grounds, but in their own relentless winters. In the shadowed gloom of that December, the balance of hope itself began to shift. Soviet generals, emboldened by fresh intelligence and a rare break in diplomatic clouds, had made a decision that would tilt the scale. More than 30 divisions were hurried westward by train, traversing thousands of frozen miles after word arrived that Japan would not strike in the Far East. This single pivot released over 500,000 additional men into the defense of Moscow. The arrival of these Siberian troops was no mere rumor. German sentries with binoculars pressed to frostbitten faces glimpsed the telltale white uniforms and quick, purposeful movements that belonged to a force with nothing to prove and everything to avenge. In the early hours, commanders whispered that a new wind was blowing, bringing with it not only more guns, but a kind of grim joy among Soviet ranks, as if the land itself were rallying to its defense. The bleak beauty of the Russian winter set the stage for a reckoning. Nights grew even colder, the darkness deeper and more absolute, with only the unblinking glare of watchfires or the brief flashes of shell bursts to break the monotony. Under the thrum of artillery, sometimes so steady it seemed to replace the very rhythm of the heart, the sense of impending doom began to splinter German morale. Rumors moved through the trenches faster than any official order. Tanks lost to the cold, columns of supply wagons simply disappearing into the dark, and distant howls of wolves threading through the moments between barrages. Every new crack in the routine felt like a precursor to collapse. Inside the headquarters, German officers pored over charts and bundles of intercepted messages, lit by the flickering glow of stubby candles. The longer the cold endured, the thinner their lines stretched, both in strength and in spirit. Orders for extra fuel or rations went unanswered. Bulletins from Berlin no longer spoke of swift victory or the glory of conquest, but instead begged for patience, hinting that adversity could be braved with discipline alone. As days vanished and nights stacked up, the magnitude of their miscalculation took on a tangible chill. Moscow, a city just 200 miles away after the hard-fought campaign at Smolensk, now seemed impossibly distant, a prize receding with each frozen breath. Somewhere in the darkness, a solitary figure, the German machine gunner, whose hands were wrapped in torn sections of a scarf, considered the way his weapon had jammed that morning, ice locking the action until he could do nothing but wait. He feared not just enemy attack, but the paralysis of helplessness that accompanied every malfunction, every snapped shovel handle, every ration that crumbled to dust in the cold. At intervals, the wind would shift and carry with it the unmistakable sound of new voices, Russian, clear and unhurried, barking orders as fresh columns advanced. The ground, once pocked by the retreat of summer mud, had crystallized under heavy boots, each step ringing dully on the earth like a tolling bell. That was the first real warning. The Soviets had begun to move, and with them the war's pulse quickened. Further west, in a hastily constructed airfield surrounded by skeletal trees, Luftwaffe crews huddled around their aircraft, engines struggling as bitter air solidified the lubricants. Pilots, lips blue beneath leather helmets, looked to the sky for any sign that conditions would break, desperate for the edge their 3,000-strong force had brought at the outset of Operation Barbarossa. Now, each sortie strained against both weather and exhaustion, as the priorities of survival threatened to outstrip the demands of conquest. On the Soviet side, anticipation was palpable amongst the Siberian reinforcements. Many harbored memories of winters even more brutal than what now surrounded them, and the hum of incoming T-34s filled the air with the promise of retribution. Soviet officers reviewed orders in low voices beneath camouflage netting, tracing lines in snow with gloved fingers, eyes steady with the knowledge that the fate of Moscow and the entire Soviet Union was tangled in the coming days. A series of critical decisions, forged in the crucible of uncertainty, began to play out. German field marshals debated retreat or redoubled assaults, paralyzed by a creeping doubt that their illustrious advances had merely carried them into an ambush set by nature itself. Supplies dwindled. Trucks, many now frozen solid, were stripped for parts or burned for heat. Somewhere, deep inside a command bunker, Hitler's preoccupation with Soviet Russia's vast resources still echoed, distant yet swelling with each telegram describing a new crisis at the front. Suddenly, as dusk bled into night, a pattern interrupt swept through the battered landscape. The soft rumble of approaching armor sharpened into a chorus of engines, dozens, then hundreds of T-34s advancing ghost-like through the swirling snow. The sound paralyzed the German infantry, who watched, powerless, as the cold, resistant steel monsters cut through the woods with unnerving ease. In the brief moments of deafening silence between tank engines and artillery, a wave of anxiety broke openly for the first time, not only among foot soldiers, but command staff as well. Had they underestimated the land, or something far deeper? All through early December, German defenses shrank under the weight of not just Soviet firepower, but a crushing certainty that the elements would claim as many lives as the bullets did. The anticipation on both sides swelled with every report of fresh units funneling in, every rumor of force concentrations somewhere beyond the tree line. Through it all, the steady drumbeat of artillery remained, a relentless, omnipresent reminder that the reckoning was coming, and with it, the future of Europe hung by a thread. Just as the German columns, battered by frost and doubt, began to falter before the battered gates of Moscow, something unmistakable stirred in the darkness beyond their reach. Soviet guns prepared to speak, and on the edge of silence stood a storm, not of winter winds, but of fire and steel, waiting to erupt. A heavy stillness lingers in the early winter air over Eastern Europe, broken only by the distant thunder of artillery, snow piles high along the battered approaches to Moscow, muffling footsteps and absorbing the heat from desperate infantry. In the pre-dawn shadows of December 5th, 1941, a different sound rises, the measured staccato pulse of Soviet guns unfurling a curtain of fire. Flashes light the horizon, rippling through the tangled forests and across the frozen ground, each eruption echoing like the heartbeat of a nation newly awakened to defiance. Inside a hastily fortified Soviet command post, frost etches the window panes. The air, thick with pipe smoke, and the static urgency of crackling radios, sits heavy around Joseph Stalin. His eyes remain fixed on the shifting battle maps, every movement captured in colored pins and urgent scribbles. The future, for weeks so perilously uncertain, now glimmers behind narrowed eyes. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, steely and resolute, stands beside him, voice low but unwavering as he issues his latest orders. Zhukov, with his air of implacable calm, has become the architect of Moscow's defense, the unseen hand guiding tired reserves toward where the line will bend but not break. Fields to the west are transformed, where just days before the Wehrmacht's armored columns, proud and invincible, ground steadily eastward, the world now reels in reverse. Emerging from whiteout snowdrifts and birch thickets, Soviet T-34s thunder forward, their engines rumbling beneath the howling wind. Infantrymen, faces dusted with frost, hurl themselves into battle with a grim resolve. The counteroffensive has shattered the once immaculate order of the German advance. Panzers, bogged in knee-deep snow, their fuel lines cracking in temperatures that turn breath to ice, lurch backward in confusion. Across the front, uncertainty becomes an omnipresent shadow. Radios, once alive with German boasts, now sputter urgent pleas for reinforcement and retreat. Company commanders, chins bristling with frostbite, squint through binoculars at a horizon alive with muzzle flashes and tracer fire. Each hour, overnight, the front twists and folds back upon itself. Landmarks of recent German victories are consumed by smoke and swept away in snow. Soldiers huddle in bomb craters and ruined villages, shivering more from dread than cold. This sudden rupture in the expected, once a hard certainty of German momentum, ripples all the way back to the cavernous command, bunkers of Army Group Center. News of the Soviet counterstrike stalks the halls, each staff officer scanning reports, hands trembling as strategic certainties crumble before their eyes. The familiar patterns of conquest are replaced by maps covered in red arrows, surging westward with relentless intent. For Hitler, the reversal is intolerable. In the wood-paneled gloom of his headquarters, frustration mounts with every telephone call, each dispatch bleaker than the last. He paces, boots echoing sharply against stone floors, gaze turning glassy and distant. Then, abruptly, command structure, that iron edifice of German precision, snaps under the weight of his anger. Dismissals are swift. Officers with decades of battle behind them are stripped of command, from Guderian to von Brauchitsch, and 35 others in their wake. A chill wind sweeps through the upper echelons of the Wehrmacht. Orders become missives of fear, decisions, decrees of survival. Officers second-guess, knowing that the fate of each man, from general to private, teeters on the whim of a distant leader whose confidence has curdled into suspicion. On December 19th, Adolf Hitler takes the ultimate step, wrenching personal control of the army from his generals. He sits hunched at his own vast maps, eyes darting from city to city, threading his will through every order. But distance and indecision mix with panic, turning routine messages into pronouncements that reverberate down the fragile chain of command. Meanwhile, at the frozen fringes of the front, soldiers of both armies fight not only the enemy, but the elements. Boots crack on the ice, rifles jam from the cold, lips split and bleed as frostbite nips at exposed skin. All the grand strategies dissolve into the simplest question: will we survive until dawn? A sharp reversal seizes the center of the drama. German units, caught mid-movement, careen backward, stunned and exposed. Soviet forces press relentlessly, buoyed by the first breath of hope the Red Army has tasted since the opening days of war. The drumbeat of artillery shifts from defense to relentless pursuit. Suddenly, German libraries of doctrine and experience seem powerless amid the storm of shifting snow and smoke. Each report from the lines brings another name crossed out, another stretch of land lost to the grasping cold. But inside the heart of Moscow, that grim determination does not translate to a simple sense of safety. Zhukov moves through dim corridors, boots tracking slush, a single light burning above his desk. Each new victory brings fresh risk. Supply lines fray in the cold. Men drop from exhaustion. And the future is still skein with uncertainty. Beyond the city, the pitch and swell of battle reshape the familiar landscapes of the Russian steppe. Footprints vanish beneath blizzard gusts. Tank tracks disappear into drifts, and every distant explosion makes the earth throb. Faces in the trenches blur into anonymity, united by a single emotion, exhaustion edged with dread. Every few hours, as dusk falls once again over the battered remnants of the German front, stray flares arc upward and die in silence against the overcast sky. Somewhere to the north, the first frozen trucks edge across Lake Ladoga, the lifeline of besieged Leningrad, slowly coming to life along an uncertain ribbon of ice. The war on the Eastern Front is no longer a story of audacious speed. It has become a test of resilience, measured in blood and resolve. Inside Soviet bunkers, old samovars hiss while troops gather in clusters around oil stoves, sharing hunks of black bread. Their laughter, brittle and brief, is a fragile defense against the darkness stretching beyond the city walls. For the Axis, once masters of movement and surprise, each day now teeters at the edge of collapse. The certainty of victory dulls to anxious calculation. Hitler, wrestling with the fallout of his decisions, finds himself isolated as the tide of reports, each colder and more desperate than the last, mounts against the silence. Even now, As the counter-offensive ripples across hundreds of miles, the ultimate fate of millions remains clouded in uncertainty. Every chance encounter, every order relayed in the dead of night, might tip the balance between life and oblivion. Nations themselves seem to tremble under the weight of these hours. Yet fate gathers itself beyond the snowbound forests of Moscow. On this breath-held frontier, history waits for new forces to break the deadlock, compressing the hopes and fears of a continent into the measured rhythm of distant explosions. The front simmers with more questions than answers. What will be unleashed once the world's gaze shifts yet again to new horizons? Far beyond the snows of Moscow, another storm crashes into the world order. Japanese aircraft descend suddenly upon Pearl Harbor, pushing the United States into open war. A December wind howls through Berlin's grey corridors. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the air is thick with tobacco and anxiety, as news slides across polished desks and buzzing radios. The signal from Hawaii, translated and relayed, brings a world-altering revelation. Japanese warplanes, without warning, have struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The information spreads like a crackling fire. Officers in steel-grey uniforms glance at each other. The murmur flickers. Could this be an opportunity, or the opening of yet another deadly front? Far to the east, the awakening is colder and heavier. In the battered field headquarters along the Eastern Front, Soviet and German commanders are roused by urgent telegrams. The distant thunder of artillery rolls across broken fields, underscoring each word of the broadcast. The world balance seems to shift in a heartbeat. In Moscow, Stalin sits impassive beneath the yellow glare of his desk lamp, the walls lined with maps bleeding red and blue. In Washington, D.C., fear and resolve mingle in the marble hallways across continents. The stakes become universal. Back in Berlin's war room, Hitler's reaction is swift and shocking, even to those who know his impulsiveness. Ignoring the cautious glances of his generals, and without the careful planning that has marked earlier gambits, he orders the drafting of a declaration of war against the United States. The decision feels less like a calculation and more like a lurch toward the abyss. He believes, almost reflexively, that Germany must stand with Japan. The reasoning is thin, yet the consequences are immense. Suddenly, the Axis faces not only the grinding war in the East and the attrition of Britain, but the industrial and military power of the United States. Generals exchange wary looks. Some try to mask their concern, the tension ticking in their temples. Operation Barbarossa has already pressed their divisions to the limit. Now, spread thinner, the German High Command senses the very real danger of a multi-front disaster. Outside, the white flecks of snow swirl in the searchlights. In bunkers dug into the frozen earth near Smolensk, German junior officers listen to static-filled broadcasts while tracing the jagged lines of the front on battered maps. Each message feels heavier. Each update a weight added to the silent drumbeat of uncertainty. It is not just the fate of armies, but the destiny of nations at stake. Inside a frost-bitten tent, a Soviet communications officer eavesdrops on the same news, his hands trembling over the Morse key. For months, the Red Army has braced for the worst, fueled by rumors and desperate hope. The khaki-clad soldiers share bleak jokes under breath, warming their hands over small stoves, while outside, the distant shell fire never ceases. Twist comes, sharp and sudden, a pattern interrupted by roaring engines. On a still night outside Moscow, the ground vibrates with the arrival of something new, the Red Army's T-34 tank. Its angular form and fast-moving tracks make it a harbinger of reversal in a landscape pocked with craters and burnt-out vehicles. Rumors of this steel beast, nearly invulnerable to most German shells, have already begun to circulate among both friend and foe. Lieutenant Erich Voss, a German panzer commander, watches headlights flicker through the trees and knows each encounter with the T-34 costs more in men and materiel. The German advance, so confident in June, now feels snagged by ice, steel, and the Soviet enemy that refuses to collapse. Yet, as the storm escalates, the voices in Berlin's hallowed halls grow uneasy. Hitler's deep hatred for communism continues to cloud his strategic vision, an obsession that overrides warnings from seasoned advisors. The generals, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, recognize the danger in stretching the Wehrmacht east and now west. In a hallway thick with smoke, Field Marshal von Brochich lowers his voice. "We are fighting on borrowed time and borrowed blood." His words are carried away by the persistent thrum of far-off artillery. Over 2 million Soviet men are now arrayed across the western approaches, masses of humanity dug into snow and scorched earth. At dawn, the expanse from Leningrad to the Black Sea is shrouded by mist and frost. The frozen trees glimmer with ice, muffling the horizon. In Moscow's underground command post, officers scan for breakthroughs, tracking each crack in the German lines with red grease pencil. The possibility of an Allied partnership against the Axis seems less distant, a whispered hope among Allied strategists. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt's words echo, firm, measured, heavy with both grief and determination. The American entry sends fresh energy and resources toward the USSR, and Soviet resolve crystallizes in the freezing months. Again and again, decisions ripple outward. Each order, a mobilization, a push, a retreat, reverberates along every front. The sound of distant artillery never fades. In a shuddering rail car, somewhere between Kursk and Urel, a Russian conscript lies awake, the steel rails singing beneath him, his mind circling images of home and the shifting face of the enemy. Will this great war ever end? Or is it now destined to engulf all? Outside, the sky hangs low and lurid above Stalingrad and Kiev, where shifting alliances and miscalculations write a new order in blood and ash. The stakes, once fundamentally European, have become truly global. The world holds its breath. In a single month, the war's boundaries have burst open, and the fate of millions, on snow-choked roads and distant islands, sways on decisions made in panic and pride. In the eerie hush after a bombardment, frost stills the air, mingled with the copper tang of spent shells. No one knows what the next day holds. But in every command post and every ravaged village, the drumbeat of distant guns and the weight of uncertainty are the only constant. Months will crawl by, the thunder of war dragging always toward a grinding, uncertain stalemate along the frozen, battered front. The snows of 1942 pressed down on Eastern Europe with the force of 1,000 burdens, every inch of white masking scars, twisting memories, and hiding the wounds of a continent on fire. In the pine forests near Rzeszów, German sentries peered through the gloom, their faces gaunt and unshaven, breath curling in the freezing air. Distant artillery pounded a relentless tattoo, sometimes near, sometimes far, always reminding those crouched beneath shattered trees that death hovered never more than a nervous heartbeat away. The Russians called it the Rasputitsa, a season when roads dissolved to mud and lifelines vanished in the mire. Yet for all the muck and misery, it was the sudden, brutal onset of winter that sank deepest into the bones of exhausted soldiers, an unending, numbing cold more ruthless than any rifle. In ramshackle dugouts and hastily built command posts, the old arrogance had ebbed. The quick victories of the prior summer seemed as distant as another world now. Months ago, Wehrmacht planners stared at impossibly optimistic maps. Moscow would fall swiftly, Kiev before the leaves dropped, Leningrad by autumn. By now, the very word, Barbarossa, once an emblem of unstoppable might, came to sound like a cruel joke, muttered bitterly under one's breath. Supplies ran thin. Steel froze to fingers. Each new order from Berlin seemed less certain, less tethered to the broken, sprawling lines of the Eastern Front. Yet behind that fog of hardship, the true struggle was not just for cities or rivers, but for momentum. The fate of millions hung on every day of the stalemate, and both sides felt the weight of that burden. The Russians kept fighting, they said, not for Stalin alone, but because the land itself seemed to demand it. In the forests and fields stretching toward Moscow, battered Red Army units drew strength from reserves still undreamed in the German imagination. Conscripts pulled from distant republics, Siberian riflemen hardened by other winters, even work crews feverishly building ice fortifications by hand. Stalin, refusing once again to cede ground, had commanded a sweeping offensive along the entire length of the front, desperate to transform hope into hard-won advantage. Inside the Soviet headquarters miles behind the lines, the air quivered with tension. Dusty maps covered in red pencil scratches crisscrossed battered tabletops, while officers hissed urgent commands through frosted breath. Flames flickered in battered oil lamps, flicking yellow against icy rafters. Outside, the thunder of distant Katyusha rockets offered a percussive heartbeat, every volley a whispered promise that the Soviet counterattack near Moscow could turn stalemate into rout. Over newly churned earth, armored columns inched forward, sometimes gaining a mile or two, sometimes losing twice as much. When the front settled again, the Russians had pushed forward, reclaiming villages lost months before, but at a staggering cost in men and materiel. There, as the new year dawned, came the first shudder of reversal. Hitler, once so certain that the East would collapse, found himself staring at a campaign gone disastrously off script. Orders now arrived with new urgency. The Führer realized he needed a new strategy, forced to reckon with brutal realities he had never planned for. The Moscow offensive, believed unstoppable, had stalled amid snowbanks stained dark. Even as the Luftwaffe often held a lopsided presence in the skies, roughly a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft at points during the Moscow offensive, their pilots faced bitter cold and an enemy who refused to break. For the men in battered trenches, air superiority brought little comfort as frostbite gnawed at exposed skin, and Russian sniper fire claimed yet more exhausted souls. By now, news from far beyond the Russian steppes began to rattle nerves. From the marble halls of London to drafty ministries in Berlin, strategy turned on rumours. British successes on other fronts, the stubborn resistance of pro-British Greece months before, and the ever-present possibility of new combatants entering the war, all knotted the strands of anxiety ever tighter. Stalin himself brooded over maps in a Moscow bunker, haunted by the spectre of Japanese forces in Siberia, fearing a second front would stretch Soviet defenses to breaking point. The Soviets held, but their grasp remained at risk of slipping with each gamble. From inside Berlin's war rooms, the mood had grown tenser still. Generals debated, voices low yet urgent, each aware that victory demanded a new kind of calculation. Some argued for a renewed drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, their words shadowed with desperation. Others pleaded for consolidation, fewer risks, more defense, anything to stanch the bleeding along a front that seemed to expand with every week. Even the most loyal officers saw the war machine stutter, its gears grinding under the weight of logistical nightmares and relentless Soviet resistance. Documents shuffled silently under trembling hands as staff updated maps, the dream of sweeping eastward now replaced by the fear of encirclement and collapse. And in the devastated countryside, the ordinary soldier endured. In foxholes and shattered barns, men stared toward the pale, flickering horizon, listening for the dull thump of mortars or the ghostly whine of T-34 engines. Their thoughts ran in circles, memories of home, the taste of black bread, the whispered hope of surviving just one more night. Sometimes the artillery's drumbeat slowed, replaced for a moment by the silent shimmer of snow falling on mass graves, reminding all that this war was a contest no longer merely of armies, but of endurance, will, and fate itself. Nearly every week brought a new twist. In the south, sudden Red Army thrusts threatened German supply lines, forcing desperate counterattacks. On the Central Front, whole towns switched sides 3 times in a month as commanders gambled everything for a stretch of muddy road. Even far to the rear, whispers of partisans and sabotage eroded Axis confidence, casting doubt not just on victory, but on survival. In this time, unity and morale were as easily shattered as glass. Yet if the fate of nations rested on these moments, so too did the character of the age. Each chain of command, entrenched in belief and blind ambition, wrestled nightly with the shifting consequences of choices made months before. No single decision could snap the Eastern Front in two. Rather, the war's tide changed by increments, each setback a drumbeat echoing toward inevitable collapse. One wonders at times how it felt to be amid it all, not as a general or head of state, but simply as a witness, caught between ice and fire, knowing history's greatest gamble was playing out beneath leaden skies. In the tense calm before another barrage, every sense spoke of uncertainty. The acrid tang of powder drifting through ruined streets, the jarring silence that sometimes followed endless violence, and above all, the sense of watching a world tip, slowly but relentlessly, toward transformation. As the months wore on, the front lines slowed and thickened like congealed blood, each mile a testament to losses and desperation. Even then, The world waited. Would the Axis rediscover momentum, or had the Soviet resolve proved unbreakable? The answer seeped into every report, every ruined town. Victory now belonged not to the swift, but to those who endured the unspeakable grind. In that numbing, endless winter, the seeds of Axis defeat took root. The Red Army's battered boot prints, the haunted gaze of frostbitten soldiers, the echoing thud of distant artillery, these became the signatures of a new era. From the heaps of ruined steel and broken hopes across Eurasia, the old certainties smashed by this struggle, history's axis shifted for good, and the world would never turn the same way again.